son turned the key on us, I realized something I had spent my whole life refusing to believe. Love does not always protect you from betrayal. It was early autumn, the kind of evening when the air turns crisp, but the house still holds the warmth of summer. Harold and I were sitting at our kitchen table, sipping chamomile tea, talking about nothing important. At our age, you learn that the small conversations matter most. We had signed the house over to our son, Daniel, just 3 months earlier. It had seemed like the sensible thing to do. "You won't have to worry about anything anymore," he'd said. "I'll take care of everything." I believed him. A mother always does. That evening, Daniel and his wife, Courtney, came downstairs with tight smiles and tense shoulders. I noticed the way Courtney avoided looking at me. There was something rehearsed about their movements, like actors preparing for a scene. "Mom, Dad," Daniel began, rubbing his hands together. "We need to talk about some changes." Changes. That word has broken more homes than storms ever have. He explained that they needed space, that Harold and I were too involved, that the house felt crowded. I remember gripping the edge of the table, trying to steady the tremble in my fingers. This was the home Harold built with his own hands. I chose the curtains. I planted the lilac bush outside the kitchen window. Before I could fully understand what was happening, Courtney said something that still echoes in my chest. "Maybe it's time you two move downstairs for a while. It'll be temporary." Temporary. They led us to the basement, our own basement, freshly cleared, except for 2 folding cots and a lamp. I thought perhaps this was some misunderstanding. Surely Daniel wouldn't. But then I heard it. The click, the unmistakable turn of a lock. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, like it had forgotten how to move. I walked to the door and tried the handle gently at first, then harder. It wouldn't budge. "Daniel," I called, forcing calm into my voice. "This isn't funny." No answer. Only silence. I felt panic rising inside me, hot and humiliating. At 72 years old, I had just been locked in my own basement by the boy whose scraped knees I once kissed better. I began pacing, my heart pounding so loudly it felt like it might burst. "Harold, we need to call someone. The neighbors, the police. This is madness." But my husband did not panic. Harold simply sat on the edge of the cot, hands folded, eyes steady, almost thoughtful. Then he looked up at me, and in a voice so calm it startled me, he whispered, "Quiet, Margaret. They don't know what's behind this wall." The way he said it, not frightened, not angry, but certain. I stopped pacing. "What do you mean?" I asked. Harold stood slowly and walked toward the far corner of the basement, the part with the old brickwork we hadn't touched in decades. He ran his fingers across the wall like he was greeting an old friend, and in that moment, I realized there were things about my husband, things buried deeper than this basement, that I had never fully known. And whatever secret he had hidden for nearly 40 years, it was about to change everything. I had been married to Harold for 49 years, And yet that night, standing in the dim basement light, I felt like I was looking at a stranger. "Harold," I whispered, trying to keep my voice from shaking. "What are you talking about?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he pressed his palm against the old brick wall in the far corner, the one behind the shelves where we used to store canned peaches and Christmas decorations. His fingers traced the mortar lines carefully, like he was counting something only he could see. "You remember the year Daniel left for college?" he finally asked. Of course I did. That was the year the house felt unbearably quiet. I had cried into Daniel's empty pillow more than I ever admitted. But what did that have to do with this? That was the year I made a promise to myself. Harold continued softly, a promise that no matter what happened, we would never be powerless in our own home. His words unsettled me. Harold was never dramatic. He was a practical man, steady, quiet, dependable. He fixed leaky faucets and balanced checkbooks. He didn't speak in riddles. "Harold," I said more firmly, "Daniel locked us down here." "I know," he replied calmly. That calmness was almost infuriating. Then, without another word, he crouched down and pressed his thumb against a particular brick near the floor. I watched, confused, as he pushed it inward. There was a faint clicking sound. And then, to my utter disbelief, a small section of the wall shifted, not dramatically, not loudly, just enough to reveal a narrow metal panel hidden behind the bricks. I gasped. "Harold, what is that?" He looked up at me with the faintest smile, not proud, not smug, just prepared. "Insurance," he said. My heart thudded harder. Insurance for what? For exactly this. He reached behind the panel and pulled out a small locked box, dusty, but clearly maintained. He held it carefully, almost reverently, as if it contained something fragile. My mind raced. How could there be a secret compartment in this house, in my house? And I never knew. Had he really kept this from me for nearly 4 decades? "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, and I hated how small my voice sounded. Harold sighed, sitting back on the cot with the box resting on his lap. "Because you love too easily, Margaret," he said gently. "And I didn't want this secret to burden you unless it ever became necessary." Necessary. The word felt heavy in the damp basement air. Upstairs, I could faintly hear footsteps, Daniel and Courtney, moving around like nothing had happened. The normalcy of it made my stomach twist. Were they planning to keep us down here overnight? Longer? Harold opened the small box using a key he wore around his neck. A key I had always assumed was for some forgotten toolbox in the garage. Inside were documents, bank statements, property records, a small USB drive, and something else. The house, he said quietly, was never fully theirs. I blinked at him. But we signed it over. We transferred occupancy rights. He corrected gently, not ownership of everything. My mind struggled to catch up. "Harold, what did you do?" He met my eyes, steady and calm. "I made sure that if anyone ever tried to push us out of our own lives, we would still have control." For the first time since I heard that lock turn, my panic began to loosen its grip. Upstairs, I heard the front door close. They were leaving. And as the sound of their car engine faded into the night, Harold stood up again and placed his hand on the hidden panel. "Now," he said quietly, "let me show you what they should have never underestimated." And suddenly, I wasn't afraid anymore. I was curious. The moment their car pulled out of the driveway, something inside me shifted. Just minutes earlier, I had felt like a frightened old woman locked in a damp basement by her own child. But now, watching Harold stand calmly beside that hidden panel, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Protected. "Harold," I said slowly, still trying to steady my breathing, "start explaining from the beginning." He nodded, as if he had always known this day might come. "You remember when Daniel wanted us to refinance the house 15 years ago?" he asked. Of course, I remembered. Daniel had just married Courtney, and they were eager, ambitious. They had big plans, big dreams, big ideas about renovating and expanding. Harold had seemed hesitant at the time, but eventually he agreed. "That wasn't just refinancing," Harold continued. "That was restructuring." He opened the metal panel wider, revealing something I never imagined existed behind that old brick. A narrow, concealed door, not large enough to walk through easily, but enough to squeeze inside. "Harold," I whispered, "what is this?" "A secondary access space," he replied calmly. "Built when we remodeled the basement. It connects to the old storm cellar exit that was sealed decades ago." I stared at him. "You built a secret exit," he smiled faintly. "Not for drama, Margaret, for protection." I suddenly remembered those months when he spent long evenings downstairs, fixing wiring and reinforcing beams. I had never questioned it. Harold liked projects. That was all. But this was more than a project. This was foresight. He stepped into the narrow opening and motioned for me to follow. My heart pounded as I squeezed through. The air inside was cool and dry, surprisingly clean. At the far end, there was a small metal ladder leading upward. "That ladder," he said quietly, "comes out behind the tool shed in the backyard." My mouth fell open. "They locked us in," he continued gently, "but they forgot something very important." "What?" He looked at me with calm certainty. "They assumed we were helpless." The words landed softly but powerfully. For years, I had convinced myself that aging meant shrinking, becoming smaller, quieter, less relevant. I had allowed Daniel to speak over us, to make decisions, to treat this house like his accomplishment rather than our life's work. And now here we were, not trapped, prepared. Harold closed the hidden panel again from the inside and guided me carefully up the ladder. My hands trembled slightly as I climbed, not from fear, but from disbelief. When he pushed open the concealed hatch, cool night air rushed over my face. We stepped out behind the shed. The house looked the same as it always had, warm lights glowing through the windows. Curtains I had sewn myself gently shifting in the breeze. But something had changed. I had changed. "Where are we going?" I asked. Harold reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "To make a call," he said. "To who?" He hesitated for just a second, not uncertain, just deliberate. "To someone who understands contracts better than our son does." That was when it hit me. This wasn't just about a hidden door. This was about ownership, legality, leverage, and perhaps something even bigger. As we quietly walked toward the driveway, staying out of sight, I felt a mixture of heartbreak and resolve tangled inside my chest. Daniel thought he had cornered us, but he had forgotten something simple. His father built this house, and his mother remembered every promise ever made within its walls. And tomorrow morning, our son was going to learn a lesson neither of us ever wanted to teach, but perhaps one he desperately needed. I never imagined I would spend one of the longest nights of my life sitting in a 24-hour diner with my husband, waiting to call a lawyer. Yet there we were. Harold ordered black coffee. I ordered nothing. My stomach felt too tight to swallow. Outside the window, I could see the faint glow of our neighborhood in the distance. Somewhere in that quiet stretch of houses was the home we had built from nothing, and the son who believed he now controlled it. "Did you really think this might happen one day?" I asked softly. Harold stirred his coffee slowly before answering. "I hoped it never would." That wasn't the same as saying no. He explained everything in steady, careful pieces. The way he always assembled furniture, one bolt at a time. Years ago, when Daniel insisted we plan ahead and transfer the property to avoid probate complications, Harold had agreed, but not blindly. He had kept the land under a family trust, a trust Daniel didn't fully understand because he never asked enough questions. He only heard what he wanted to hear. "The house is yours." But it wasn't fully his, I asked. "Not without our signatures," Harold replied calmly. "And certainly not with what he did tonight." My heart twisted at that. There is a particular kind of pain that comes when your child disappoints you. It is not sharp like anger. It is heavy like grief. You mourn the version of them you thought you raised. "Do you think Courtney pushed him into this?" I asked. Harold looked at me with a tired gentleness. "It doesn't matter who pushed. He turned the key." That truth settled between us like cold air. Around midnight, Harold finally made the call. I listened as he explained the situation in a composed voice, carefully avoiding emotion. He wasn't vengeful. He was factual. Locked in basement. No written agreement. Elderly homeowners displaced without consent. The lawyer's tone shifted immediately. By the time Harold hung up, there was a quiet firmness in his posture I hadn't seen in years. "They made a mistake," he said simply. "What kind of mistake?" "The kind that can't be undone." We didn't go back to the house that night. Instead, we checked into a small roadside motel 2 towns over. It wasn't glamorous, faded carpet, humming air conditioner. But I have never felt more awake. As I lay in that unfamiliar bed, staring at the ceiling, Memories flooded me. Daniel's first steps across that very living room floor, the way he used to run into our bedroom during thunderstorms, the birthday cakes, the scraped knees. How does that little boy become the man who locks his parents in a basement? Somewhere between love and entitlement, something had shifted. Just before I drifted off to sleep, Harold reached over and squeezed my hand. "I never wanted to use any of this," he whispered. "I know," I said. "But tomorrow," he continued softly, "we're not going back as victims." The next morning would not be loud. There would be no shouting. But there would be consequences. And as dawn slowly crept through the thin motel curtains, I realized something painful and powerful at the same time. Sometimes the greatest act of love is not forgiveness. Sometimes it is accountability. And Daniel was about to face it. I thought I would feel triumphant the next morning. Instead, I felt tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixes, but the kind that settles in your bones after loving someone longer than they deserve. Harold and I drove back just after sunrise. The sky was pale pink, the neighborhood quiet and unsuspecting. Our house stood exactly as it always had: a white siding, blue shutters, the lilac bush brushing against the kitchen window. For a moment, I almost convinced myself none of it had happened. But then I saw the basement light still glowing faintly through the small window near the foundation. A reminder. We didn't go to the front door. We walked calmly to the backyard. Harold opened the shed, lifted the concealed hatch, and helped me down the ladder into the hidden passage. My heart beat steadily this time, not frantic, not afraid. Focused. Inside the basement, everything looked the same as we'd left it. 2 folding cots, a lamp, a locked door. Harold pressed the brick again. Click. We stepped back into the main basement area just as we heard footsteps upstairs. Daniel's voice drifted faintly through the floorboards. "Mom, Dad," he sounded casual, almost cheerful. He must have come downstairs expecting to find us exactly where he left us. Instead, when he unlocked the basement door and swung it open, he froze. We were standing there, not panicked, not pleading, waiting, his face drained of color. "How did you?" he began, eyes darting to the door, the windows, the walls. Courtney appeared behind him, equally stunned. "You locked us in," I said quietly. My voice surprised even me. It was calm. "That was unwise." Daniel ran a hand through his hair. "Mom, it was just for the night. We needed to figure some things out." "By imprisoning us?" Harold asked evenly. Courtney stepped forward defensively. "We weren't imprisoning you. We were just creating boundaries." Boundaries. Such a polite word for betrayal. Harold didn't argue. He simply pulled a folder from under his arm, the documents from the hidden box, and handed them to Daniel. "What's this?" Daniel muttered, flipping through the pages. "The trust agreement," Harold replied, "the one you never fully read." Daniel's brow furrowed as he scanned the lines. Courtney leaned over his shoulder. And then I saw it. Realization. The property remains under our legal control, Harold continued gently. Any attempt to restrict our access or remove us without written agreement constitutes unlawful displacement. Daniel looked up sharply. You're threatening us. I felt something break quietly inside my chest. No, I said, we're correcting you. There was no shouting, no dramatic explosion, just silence, heavy, undeniable silence. You transferred occupancy rights, Harold explained, not ownership of the land or final authority. And after last night, we are revoking those rights. Courtney's face hardened. You can't just, we can, Harold said softly. Daniel looked between us, panic creeping into his voice. Where are we supposed to go? For a brief second, I saw my little boy again. Lost, afraid, and it hurt. But love without respect becomes permission for cruelty. That, I replied gently, is something you should have considered before locking your parents in a basement. The room felt smaller. The power had shifted, not because we wanted revenge, but because we had finally chosen not to be silent. Daniel swallowed hard, and that was when he said something that nearly shattered me all over again. You don't understand, he whispered. We had no choice. No choice. I looked at Harold, and I realized this story wasn't finished yet. Because if my son truly believed he had no choice, then something far deeper had been happening in this house than we ever saw, and I wasn't sure I was ready to hear it. When Daniel said, we had no choice, something inside me shifted again, not toward anger, but toward dread. There is a certain tone your child uses when they are about to confess something bigger than pride. I had heard it only a few times before. Once when he wrecked Harold's truck at 17, and once when he admitted he had dropped out of a class in college and hidden it for a semester. This was that tone. Harold didn't soften. He didn't harden either. He simply waited. What do you mean? He asked quietly. Daniel ran both hands over his face. Courtney stepped back, her earlier sharpness dissolving into something closer to fear. We're in trouble, Daniel admitted. The words hung in the basement air like smoke. What kind of trouble? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated. Debt. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't criminal. It wasn't scandalous. It was worse. It was foolish. Courtney finally spoke. We invested in a development project. It was supposed to double our money in a year. Daniel's friend guaranteed it. Guaranteed. Harold's jaw tightened slightly, the only sign of emotion he allowed. It collapsed, Daniel continued. We borrowed against credit lines to cover losses. We thought if we had full control of the house, we could refinance properly. Sell if needed, sell. The word echoed painfully in my mind. This house, I asked slowly. He nodded. Yes, it's the only asset big enough to save us. There it was. Not hatred, not cruelty, desperation. You locked us downstairs, I said carefully, so you could push us out legally. Daniel didn't deny it. We were going to talk to you, he muttered weakly. When? Harold asked calmly. After the paperwork was signed. Silence answered him. I leaned against the cool brick wall, trying to steady the ache in my chest. I had raised my son to work hard, to build slowly, to avoid shortcuts. Yet somewhere along the way, he had learned to gamble instead. And when the gamble failed, he reached for the one thing he believed would always save him. Us. Courtney wiped her eyes. We were scared, she whispered. The collectors have already started calling. My heart softened against my will. Fear makes people do terrible things, but fear does not excuse them. You should have come to us, I said gently, not trapped us. Daniel's voice cracked. I was ashamed. There it was. Not greed, shame. Harold walked slowly toward him, not as an opponent, but as a father. You don't fix shame with secrecy, he said quietly. You fix it with honesty. Daniel looked down at the floor like a child being scolded. For a long moment, no one spoke. The power had shifted again, not legally this time, but emotionally. We were no longer enemies in a basement. We were a family standing in the wreckage of bad decisions. Finally, Daniel asked the question that truly mattered. What are you going to do? I looked at Harold. Then I looked at my son, and I realized this was the moment that would define the rest of our lives. Because we could protect the house, or we could try to save our son. But I wasn't sure we could do both. And whatever choice we made, it would change everything. I never thought the hardest decision of my life would come at 72. It is one thing to protect your home. It is another to protect your child from himself. Daniel stood in front of us, shoulders slumped, no longer the confident man who had turned a key on his parents, just a frightened boy drowning in consequences. Courtney hovered beside him, eyes swollen, hands trembling. Harold looked at me. In nearly 5 decades of marriage, we have mastered silent conversations. And in that glance, I saw the same question in his eyes that was burning in my chest. Do we rescue him again? Because that's what parents do. We rescue, we shield, we soften the fall. But sometimes rescuing becomes enabling. Sit down, Harold said gently. We all moved to the old wooden steps in the basement. The same steps Daniel used to slide down as a child. The irony did not escape me. How much? Harold asked calmly. Daniel swallowed. 280,000. The number felt like a physical blow. I closed my eyes briefly. That wasn't a small mistake. That was a storm. And you believed selling this house would solve it? I asked. Daniel nodded. It would cover most of it. We could start over. Start over. As if homes were replaceable. As if memories could be transferred like funds. This house is not a bailout, Harold said quietly. Daniel's jaw tightened. Then what do you expect us to do? Lose everything? I felt something stir inside me then, not anger, not bitterness, but clarity. You already lost something, I said softly. He looked at me, confused. Our trust. The words hurt to say, but they were true. Courtney began crying again. We didn't mean for it to go this far. But it did, Harold replied. Silence settled around us like dust after collapse. Finally, Harold stood up. We are not selling this house, he said firmly. Daniel flinched. But Harold continued, "We are not abandoning you either." Daniel's head lifted slowly. Harold looked at me, and I nodded. "We will help you restructure the debt," Harold said, "legally, transparently, with conditions." "What conditions?" Courtney whispered. "No more secrets," I answered. "No more shortcuts, and no control over this house, ever." Daniel's eyes filled with something I hadn't seen in a long time. Relief. "But understand this," Harold added, his voice steady but strong. "Last night was the last time you treat us as obstacles instead of parents." Daniel nodded quickly, almost desperately. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I was scared." I reached out and touched his arm. "I know," I said. Fear had nearly cost him everything. But forgiveness would not erase the lesson. We left the basement together that morning, not as victims, not as victors, but as a family painfully rebalanced. Upstairs, sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, illuminating the lilac bush swaying outside. For the first time since that awful click of the lock, I could breathe fully again. But as I stood in my kitchen, I realized something else. The real secret Harold had kept hidden for 39 years wasn't behind a brick wall. It was this: he had always prepared for the day love alone wouldn't be enough. And though we had chosen mercy, something in me understood the foundation of this family would never be quite the same again. And healing, I knew, would take longer than repayment. Healing does not begin with a grand apology. It begins with small, uncomfortable conversations. The days after that basement night felt fragile, like walking across thin ice. Daniel and Courtney moved carefully around us, speaking softly, offering to cook dinner, volunteering for chores they had never noticed before. But politeness is not the same as repentance. Harold contacted the lawyer again, this time with Daniel sitting beside him at the kitchen table. Every document was reviewed, every debt laid bare, every risky investment dissected under calm, unforgiving light. There were no more secrets, and that transparency alone felt like progress. We learned that the development scheme had promised unrealistic returns. Daniel had trusted a friend instead of verifying paperwork. Pride had kept him from asking for help when the first cracks appeared. "I didn't want you to think I failed," he admitted one evening, staring into his coffee. I reached across the table. "Failure isn't what disappoints parents," I said gently. "Dishonesty does." Courtney surprised me during that time. She was the one who began working extra hours, the one who suggested selling their second car, the one who proposed downsizing their lifestyle before asking for another cent. Fear had shaken them, but accountability was reshaping them. Harold structured a controlled loan, not a gift, backed by clear legal terms. Payments would be automatic. No refinancing of the house. No shared assets tied to future risks. "You will earn your stability back," he told Daniel calmly. And Daniel agreed. Something subtle shifted in our home after that. Not warmth, that takes longer, but respect. One afternoon, about 2 weeks later, Daniel came down to the basement alone. I watched from the top of the stairs as he stood in the corner where the hidden panel was. "You built this yourself?" he asked Harold quietly. "Yes, for us, for our future," Harold corrected gently. Daniel nodded slowly. "I underestimated you," he admitted. Harold gave a small, knowing smile. "You underestimated responsibility." That night, for the first time in months, we all sat down to dinner without tension thick in the air. Conversation was still cautious, but real. No manipulation, no rehearsed politeness, just honest, sometimes awkward rebuilding. Later, as I stood at the kitchen sink, watching the last light of sunset stretch across the yard, I felt a surprising sense of peace. Not because everything was fixed, but because something stronger had been restored. Boundaries. I used to believe unconditional love meant endless sacrifice, that a mother proves devotion by absorbing pain quietly. But I learned something in that locked basement. Love without boundaries invites disrespect. Boundaries without love create distance, but together they create balance. Daniel still has a long road ahead. Debt does not disappear overnight. Trust does not repair itself in weeks. Yet that secret behind the wall was never really about money or leverage. It was about preparedness. It was about dignity. And most of all, it was about teaching our son that parents are not lifelines to exploit, but foundations to honor. As I turned off the kitchen light and followed Harold upstairs, I squeezed his hand. "You were right to prepare," I whispered. He smiled gently. "I just never wanted to use it." "Neither did I, but sometimes the quiet strength you build in secret is the very thing that saves your family in the end. And that, I suppose, is the kind of secret worth keeping." Time does something remarkable to a house. It absorbs the echoes of raised voices. It softens the sharp edges of memory. And if you're patient enough, it allows forgiveness to settle like dust in sunlight. 6 months passed, not dramatically, not perfectly, but steadily. Daniel kept his word. Payments were made on time. The risky friendships were cut off. The late-night secrecy was replaced with spreadsheets and long, sometimes humbling conversations at our kitchen table. Courtney took on extra projects at work. They sold the second car. They even canceled vacations they had once bragged about planning. I watched my son relearn discipline, and I watched him relearn respect. One evening, he came downstairs while Harold was organizing tools in the basement. I stood at the top of the stairs, unseen, listening. "I've been thinking about that night," Daniel said quietly. Harold didn't look up. "So have I. I crossed a line," Daniel continued. "I was so focused on saving myself that I forgot who I was hurting." Harold finally turned toward him. "You weren't trying to hurt us," he said gently. "You were trying to avoid shame." Daniel nodded slowly. "But I chose the wrong way." There was no dramatic embrace, no tears, just understanding. That is how real reconciliation looks, not loud, but steady. Later that week, Daniel asked something that surprised me. "Dad, can you show me how you built the hidden panel?" Harold paused for a long moment. Then he nodded, not to teach him secrecy, but to teach him foresight. They spent an afternoon together in that basement, measuring, reinforcing, discussing structural integrity. I brought down lemonade and watched the two men bent over blueprints Harold had kept tucked away for years. For the first time in a long while, I didn't see distance between them. I saw partnership. That hidden door behind the brick wall was never truly about escape. It was about preparedness, about understanding that love is powerful, but wisdom protects it. As for the house, it remains under our trust. Daniel understands now that ownership is not just paperwork. It is stewardship, responsibility, patience, and one day, when we are truly ready, the house may become his fully. But not because he demanded it, because he earned it. Sometimes I think back to that awful click of the lock turning in the basement door. At the time, it felt like betrayal. Now, strangely, I see it as a turning point. It forced truth into the open. It forced strength out of hiding. And it reminded me of something I wish I had understood much earlier in life. Being a parent does not mean surrendering your power. Being loving does not mean being naive. And growing older does not mean becoming helpless. The secret behind that wall wasn't bricks or documents. It was dignity, and dignity, once reclaimed, changes everything. As I sit now in my favorite armchair by the window, lilac blossoms brushing softly against the glass, I feel something deeper than relief. I feel balance. Our son once locked us in the basement, but in the end, we opened a door he didn't even know he needed. And sometimes, that is the quiet miracle of family. Thank you for being here and listening. If this story touched you, please tap the like button. It helps more than you know. Subscribe if you'd like to hear more stories like this. And if you feel comfortable, leave a comment telling me where you're listening from or sharing a small part of your own story.